My name is Peter Belser, and I'm giving this presentation on behalf of Julie Barcelona and myself. We're both curators of Coast Digital Flora of the Philippines and work at University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Coast Digital Flora of the Philippines, also called CDFP, is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. Now, as part of this session on the state of the Philippine flora, we aim to give you a mostly taxonomic perspective on the state of plant diversity in your country. This is prepared from data that we generated as part of the CDFP project. Throughout this symposium, speakers have explored many reasons of why we should care about the Philippine flora. You have heard presentations that demonstrate that native flora provides important ecosystem functions, safeguarding us against calamities such as typhoons, and sustaining our health and well-being. Aside from this, a country's native biodiversity is also part of its national identity, with strong links to culture and heritage. The importance of native plant diversity is broadly recognized. For example, in this statement from the United Nations Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. It reads, "Without plants, there's no life." That is indeed true, because the functioning of this planet, and therefore our very survival, depends on plants, critically so. Despite this, native plants are endangered. This is a result of human activities, including habitat conversion and destruction for agriculture, housing, industry, and roading, but also due to pollution, global warming, and overexploitation of natural resources. To assess the impact of these threats on biodiversity and to mitigate them through effective conservation management, current, correct, free, and publicly accessible taxonomic data about the flora of the Philippines is essential. This is knowledge that is necessary to be able to determine which species are native and which ones aren't, what their names are and what they look like, so that we can communicate about plant species and can actually recognize them. We also need to know where they grow and whether they are common, rare, or even endangered. The United Nations Global Strategy recognizes the need for such information and made it, in fact, a target to develop a flora for all known plants in which this information is recorded and made available. This is not a new idea, though, and researchers, biologists, have worked towards this for several centuries. The Philippines is in no means an exception to this. In fact, countless Philippine researchers and colleagues overseas have contributed to what we now know about Philippine plants. Two of these should be explicitly mentioned when speaking about the current state of the Philippine flora. In addition to their other scientific contributions, both spent many years of their lives on compiling what is now known about the taxonomy of the Philippines. For this, they used scientific publications, herbarium specimens, and also their own observations as data. The first of them is Alma Mercer. Mercer was an American who lived in the Philippines for over 20 years. He contributed to the knowledge of the Philippine flora in many ways, such as, for instance, by writing A Flora of Manila, a book that is still used to this very day. But in the context of this presentation, his most notable work was his enumeration of Philippine flowering plants, which was a list of plant species, synonyms, literature references, and distribution information for all flowering plant species known at that time. He published these works between 1923 and 1926. Leonard Cohen is the second person that needs to be mentioned here. You probably expected this, right? Leonard continued Mercer's works by updating Mercer's species list with new information from subsequent research projects and publications, but also by incorporating his own observations. Leonard kept this information on his computer as Microsoft Word files. And here on the slide, you can see an example of one of those files. He shared these files with colleagues and students. Because of his premature death, this work was unfortunately never finished and never published. After the passing of Leonard Cohen in 2010, we continued his work and the work of Merrill and others in the form of a photo-illustrated website and associated Facebook group, intending it to be an interactive outpost where enthusiasts and professionals could share information about Philippine plants. This was a big difference from the way in which things worked before. Whereas Merrill's works were published in book form and Cole's contribution remained unpublished, our list of Philippine plants is freely accessible to everyone with an internet connection. For the first time, and after many years of work since the website was launched in 2011, we now have a continuously updated and comprehensive account of the Philippine vascular flora. This resource contains data and resources not previously included, such as tens of thousands of plant photographs, as well as information about the conservation status of Philippine species. All of this work is in part powered by citizen scientists like yourselves, and for a large part through the CDFP Facebook group, which has 15,000 members and is very active, as you can see from these data here about the number of posts and comments in the past year. Because of Cole's Digital Flora of the Philippines, we now have a close to real-time overview of the taxonomic state of the Philippine flora. This means that now we can have a good look at some of the data about the plants of the Philippines and base our conservation management on them. I'll present some of these data in this presentation today. Our CDFP data show us that the Philippine flora is rich, unique, dynamic, and photogenic. But native plants in the Philippines are also threatened and need to be looked after better. Let's explore this. The Philippines is part of the Malaysian biogeographic region, which stretches all the way from the Malay Peninsula in Borneo and the Philippines south through Indonesia, almost to New Guinea. The Malaysian biogeographic region is a so-called biodiversity hotspot. It is a biodiversity hotspot of global significance, meaning that it has unique biodiversity, a lot of biodiversity, but also that this biodiversity is severely threatened. Within the Malaysian region, the Philippines is one of its centers of diversity, containing about a fifth of the plant species in the entire region. According to our data, there are almost 9,500 native vascular plant species in the country. Here you see one of them, a beautiful purple fruited species of the genus Mercini. These species represent almost 2,000 plant genera and 282 families. About 95% of the vascular plant species in the Philippines are native. That means that they naturally occur in the country. They have not been introduced to the country by humans. Now let's break these numbers down a little bit more by looking at the three main plant groups that we can find in the Philippines. No less than 40 families of ferns and other seedless vascular plants, such as spike mosses and club mosses, can be found in the Philippines. These contain a total of 172 genera and 1,038 species. The non-flowering seed plants, such as Almasiga, cycads, and members of the genus Podocarpus, like the one shown here, from a much smaller group than the ferns and fern allies. There are only 6 gymnosperm families in the Philippines, with 12 genera and 42 species. Most vascular plant species in the Philippines are in fact flowering plants. These are plants that produce flowers and fruits. The other 2 groups don't. There are a total of 8,891 species, classified in 1,747 genera and 236 families. Looking at the largest families of the Philippine vascular flora, we can see that orchids really stand out. Orchids are worldwide a very large family, and they're also particularly large in the Philippines. In fact, there are twice as many orchid species than those of any other plant family in the Philippines. They include this beautiful species of Rubicatia. You can see a flower here. Examples of other large families are members of the coffee family, which includes this beautiful blue fruit Glacianthus. But also the legume family, which contains Mucuna, known for its very itchy fruits and flowers. You can see the itchy hairs on the calyces of these flowers in the photograph. But also the dogbane family, which contains the wax flowers. So the family Apocynaceae is rather large, and the grass family as well. Now let's have a look at the largest genera in the Philippine flora. The orchids also contain some of the largest genera. Genera such as Bulbophyllum, Dendrobium, and Dendrochilum are particularly species-rich. You see a nice flower of Bulbophyllum catenulatum here. But Hoya, the wax plants, is a genus that is almost equally species-rich. It contains at present 207 known species. Other large genera are Syzygium, Begonia, and genera such as the figs, the genus Ficus, Sertendra, and Medinilla. So I've shown you that the Philippine flora is indeed quite rich and biodiverse. But there's also another way of looking at diversity. This shows us that the Philippine flora is in fact unique. About half of its native species, that's close to 5,000 species, are endemic to the country, meaning that they only occur in the Philippines and nowhere else in the world. Just as an example, here all members in the Philippines of the genus Rafflesia are endemic. Even this beautiful flowered species named after Leonard Cohen. At the genus level, 19 genera can only be found in the Philippines. Most of these are fairly small though, and can only contain a single species or a handful of species. But a few are a bit larger, such as the genus shown here, Velaria, of the coffee family. This genus has 11 species. Adelmyria is a genus in the ginger family. Until not too long ago, it was considered to be part of the genus Alpinia, but it was removed from it and separately recognized again. Now this genus ranks second in size among the Philippine endemic genera. In addition to being rich and unique, the flora of the Philippines is also dynamic. That means that we constantly continue to learn a lot about its biodiversity, finding new species, and finding out new information about their evolutionary relationships and taxonomy. So new species continue to be discovered. Species names and classifications are regularly updated and improved as a result of scientific research. And it is also not uncommon that species are discovered that were previously not thought to occur in the Philippines. These are native species that turn out to be a bit more widely distributed than people first assumed, but also non-native species that made it to the country more recently. Now, these numbers here show you just how dynamic the flora is. When we compared the list of species names that we had in 2011 with our current list, we noted that more than 26% of the names in today's list are either new or different from those in the 2011 list. Thanks to the hard work of Philippine scientists and others, 544 species, subspecies, and varieties have been formally described and named in the last 10 years. That's more than 5% of the flora. Many more remain to be given a scientific name. From 2020 to today, 73 species of Philippine plants were described. So this roughly covers the period between the last PNPCSI Symposium and today. Here you see just a few examples. In particular, lots of begonia species, orchids, and pitcher plant species were described. But also plants of different genera and families, and some of them will be more familiar to you than others. New discoveries in the last 10 years also include species, genera, and even one family of plants that were previously not known to the Philippines. Some of these are native, such as this wax flower species from coastal areas in eastern Luzon. But others are non-native plants that became naturalized in the country, often as weeds or as skibbies from plants that people grow in their gardens. To me, it is ironic that people prefer cultivating species from other countries as ornamentals, almost as if they are prettier than Philippine plants. But we all know that that's not the case, right? Philippine native plants are incredibly beautiful and can rival any species in the world by their beauty. Because of their importance in maintaining the ecosystems that Filipinos rely on, the work that PNPCSI is doing to make people aware of the existence and importance of Philippine native plants is very important. Coast Digital Flora of the Philippines shares this view. CDFP contributes to this mission by taking and collating photos of Philippine plants and making these photos available through its website. We currently have over 71,000 photos of Philippine plants online. They're there for everyone to access freely, and they represent about 46% of all species that we have listed on our website. This work started with making about 17,000 photos available that Leonard Cohen, Julie, Dan Nikrant, and I had taken before we started CDFP in 2011. So of those 17,000 photos, about 10,000 were photos that Leonard Cohen had taken before he died. Now, since 2011, both through targeted fieldwork that we did all over the Philippines, but also through contributions from a large number of scientists and citizen scientists, the number of photographed species has steadily grown. This graph shows this process. On the x-axis, you can see the time from when CDFP started, all the way on the left, to the present day, all the way on the right. The blue and orange lines show you the increase in the percentage of species and the number of species photographed over time. What is important to notice here is that these lines are still trending upwards. They have not plateaued yet. And that means that we're very hopeful that in the future, we will continue to be able to find photographs and take photographs of species that have not been photographed for our website before. So every month we add roughly about 10 species or so for which we did not previously have photographs. Now, with your help, I'm hopeful that we can reach 50% of all known vascular plant species of the Philippines photographed by the year 2025. I think that is possible because there are still quite a few relatively common species out there that we still need to get some photos of. So keep botanizing, keep taking plant photos. Because this is important, photographing the Philippine plant species is important. Why? Well, because it provides them with faces by which people can recognize them. That's essential because the Philippine flora is not only photogenic, but also threatened. And it is really difficult to protect endangered plant species if you don't know what they look like. There's still a considerable effort ahead of us to determine the conservation status of all Philippine native plant species. Thus far, this work has only been done for about 14% of the flora. But this table, shown here, shows us some alarming numbers for the different threat categories. They show that a large number of species for which the conservation status has been assessed are at risk. The highest threat category is the category of extinct. And for the Philippines, 8 species are listed as extinct. These are all members of the genus Psychotria, a quite large genus in the Philippines. This is a genus of the coffee family that forms woody plants, typically the size of a shrub, but also some climbers and a few low-growing plants as well. Now, the fact that all of these 8 extinct species in the Philippines are members of the genus Psychotria doesn't mean that much, though. It doesn't mean that this genus is particularly endangered. It's just the only genus for which the authors of its taxonomic revision concluded that some species are likely to be extinct. But in reality, we still know so little about the Philippine flora that we really don't know how many species have already gone extinct. In fact, many species in the Philippines are only known from a single specimen, a single encounter. And sometimes that has been many, many decades ago. So the authors of that Psychotria publication also suggested some other species of Psychotria would be extinct, such as the one shown here. But you can clearly see it's very much alive. So there is hope, and with additional biological research, we might rediscover some of these species that were thought to be extinct. Below the highest threat categories, extinct and critically endangered, are other categories such as endangered and vulnerable. This Medinilla species here is an example of a species that ranks in the former category. Some of the threats that the native flora are facing are from non-native species. Countless of these are cultivated plants that you cannot find outside of people's houses, gardens, and parks, but about 5% are naturalized, meaning that they can grow in the wild. Some of these typically don't venture far away from where people live, but others, such as the species shown here, are highly invasive. That means that they've established themselves in natural, relatively undisturbed environments. So in order to fill the substantial knowledge gap that exists about the biodiversity of the Philippines, not only more taxonomic and conservation research is needed, but also a stronger emphasis on different types of research. Most of the taxonomic research in the Philippines focuses on describing and naming individual or very small groups of species. However, some important knowledge can only be obtained by focusing on all species of a taxonomic group collectively. Some great work is being done that uses this approach, but not enough. This is partly due to underfunding of biodiversity studies in the Philippines, such as it's the case in many other parts of the world as well. If we would have more funding, then we would be able to use much more powerful scientific techniques, such as genetic and genomic approaches to understanding taxonomic diversity. Funding is also needed to support and further develop the information infrastructure that is needed for biodiversity research, such as herbarium collections and databases. To maximize their value, it is important to continue to work on improving skills and doing capacity building for the next generation of young Filipino botanists. CDFP contributes to this by working with universities and NGOs in the Philippines to provide training opportunities in field botany, such as here in Cebu. This provides us with opportunities to connect and engage with these people and connect them with each other. People who want to help us by providing the taxonomic data resources that are needed to better understand the biodiversity of the Philippine flora. So I would like to end with thanking those of you who've joined the CDFP community and helped us grow in the last 10 years. And I would like to welcome those of you who aren't already part of our community. Come join us. We've come a long way in the last 10 years, and I'm incredibly excited about what lies ahead in the coming 10 years. Thank you for your attention.